immunity, so were far more susceptible to outbreaks. By 1963, an outbreak of rubella started in Europe and spread to the U.S. In 1964, a severe rubella epidemic affected 1% of pregnancies in the U.S. It was found that congenital rubella could manifest as neonatal thrombocytic purpura, hepatitis, bone lesions, and meningoencephalitis. Other late emerging sequelae included diabetes mellitus and progressive rubella panencephalitis, which caused cataracts, heart disease, developmental disabilities, and deafness. Pediatricians at the time remember mothers who had contracted rubella struggling with the decision to have an abortion or wait and see if the baby would be born healthy. This epidemic lasted through 1965, and it became clear that a vaccine was needed to keep the disease from affecting more unborn children. And this set researchers on the road to finding a vaccine. All of them decided it was best to attenuate the vaccine using cell cultures, since it was clear from past vaccine development that cell culture passage would select for lower virulence. But each of them had different cell cultures in mind when they started. Parkman and Meyer used African green monkey cells to attenuate. They were also approved to use dog kidney cells. Their vaccine was called HPV-77. Hillemann's group used duck embryo cells. Their vaccine was called HPV-77/DEV. Prinzi used rabbit kidney cells. Their vaccine was called Sendahil. Plotkin's group used human diploid fibroblast cells. This was called RA27/3. This strain could be grown at 30 degrees Celsius, which would encourage attenuation quickly. Previous work had proven that growth at a lower temperature selected against virulence. Here's where things get interesting. All the vaccines were approved for use in 1969 and 1970 in the U.S., with the exception of RA27/3. That one was only approved in Europe. Several regulatory agencies in the United States were against using human cell strains for vaccine attenuation because they were afraid that they could contain some contaminating agent. Animal cell cultures were preferable at the time. It would take several years for human diploid strains to become the standard, and that was because they didn't contain any contaminants. For 10 years, evidence was gathered that duck embryo and dog kidney cells would both cause significant joint reactions in vaccine recipients. It was then proven that reinfection with rubella virus was frequent among those who had received any vaccine attenuated with any animal cells. The only one that had sure efficacy was the RA27/3, the human diploid cell vaccine. Around this time, safety records from Europe showed that the vaccine was safe. Opinions of scientists began to change, including Dorothy Horstman at Yale and Maurice Hilleman at Merck, who had both done extensive research on human diploid cell vaccines. So eventually, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration licensed RA27/3. After the MMR vaccine was approved, the U.S. and the U.K. began setting up vaccination programs. They each had different strategies. In the U.K., they began vaccinating adolescent girls. The military and healthcare workers were also candidates for vaccination. However, vaccination was not mandatory. The girls who had refused vaccination could still get rubella from the circulation of the virus in unvaccinated populations. In the U.S., the strategy was to vaccinate infants so that they could abolish the disease in children. Again, this was only a partial success. Pregnant women were still being exposed to rubella through children and adults. The vaccine program wouldn't be viable until those children grew up. So they had to wait an entire generation for the vaccine program to work. Scandinavian countries began vaccination efforts around this time. Finland came out on top and had eliminated rubella completely in that country. As of now, the goal is to eliminate rubella throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Pan American Health Organization made this a priority after studies of rash disease showed that there was a high prevalence of rubella virus infections along with measles infections. Low vaccination rates in Southern and Eastern Europe are impeding the progress of elimination, though. WHO has been increasing the pressure on those countries to enforce vaccination programs. Many developing countries have vaccination programs in place. Oman has confirmed a high immunization rate with RA27/3 vaccine, and Central Asia is developing vaccination programs. Thailand and Malaysia have introduced the MMR vaccine into their vaccination schedules. Japan, a country that shunned the MMR vaccine, has recently chosen to target rubella by offering a measles rubella vaccine. China has begun rubella vaccination production. Of course, sub-Saharan Africa remains the problem. Epidemiological data is poorly documented, so case numbers remain unknown, except in Ghana and South Africa. Cost becomes an issue in these areas also. At this point, vaccines containing rubella are being manufactured in the developing world, and this allows vaccination for less than 50 cents a dose. But the issue of logistics remain. It's getting those vaccines to the people who need them. After announcing the elimination of rubella in the U.S. in 2004, it became evident that elimination worldwide is possible through vaccination programs. Eradication is the next step. We did it with smallpox. We can do it with other diseases that threaten the health and well-being of populations worldwide. With smallpox, it took global awareness. With rubella, that awareness will need the response that can eventually lead to eradication. Okay, that's it for rubella. Next time we'll talk about Andrew Wakefield and his research on MMR. A lot of crazy went on there. I did get a question about mumps. Cody from Over the Fence True Crime Podcast asked if mumps was sort of an afterthought when it comes to vaccination. Do we really need to vaccinate against it? Okay, so mumps isn't really a killer disease. Most people live through it. That's one reason that we have so little information on it. Children especially seem to come through mumps just fine with no long-lasting effects from the disease. Of course, there are some rare cases where children become deaf or get encephalitis from mumps, but those are very rare cases. It's when adults get it that it starts to pose problems. Both male and female adults who get mumps can become sterile. Adults are also more likely to contract secondary pneumonia with mumps infections. I, of course, tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to vaccines, especially a vaccine that's been around for 50 years with relatively no side effects other than a sore arm. Well, unless you're me and a dingling and you choose to take all of your vaccines at once, then you become sick for days. Thank you for listening to Cause of Death. Please check the show notes for ways to support the show. Until next time, remember that eradication doesn't come just because we want it. It comes through the global efforts of several agencies. Boots on the ground, armed with vaccines, can save future generations.